Hello, everyone, and welcome to this web lecture this evening. Nice to be with you all from all parts of the world, wherever you're joining online, or also on the phone. I first want to thank the members of the Christian Science Church of Newburyport, Massachusetts, for sponsoring this web event this evening. So thank you to all of you joining in from Newburyport and the surrounding area in Massachusetts for putting on this web event tonight. As you heard, the title of our event this evening is The Healing Power of Stillness. And this talk and all that you'll hear tonight from me comes directly out of my practice of Christian Science healing. The ideas come directly from the writings of Mary Baker Eddy and the study of Christian Science. So you'll be hearing more about that as we go throughout our talk tonight. As we think about this concept of the healing power of stillness, one of the first thoughts I often have about stillness is how it seems like we can never get enough of it. When there's busy schedules and busy lives and lots of noise going on in the world about world events or maybe relationships or just issues in our own lives, how can we maintain and find the stillness that brings a sense of healing and renewal and peace to our own hearts, as well as to the hearts and minds of those around us? That's a question that we're going to be attempting to answer in just under an hour this evening. And we'll probably just scratch the surface with a few ideas that hopefully you can take back with you this evening. To start, I'd like to begin with a story that has touched me often, and it takes place, we have to go back in time a little bit to 1992, to Sarajevo. And the story took place in Sarajevo in 1992, and it was a man who was the principal cellist for the Sarajevo Opera Orchestra that inspired this story. He was watching his city of Sarajevo be destroyed in the Bosnian Civil War. And while I don't know what he was thinking or how he was processing the violence that he saw around him, he decided to take his cello and a plastic chair and go out into the middle of the square of Sarajevo and play his cello. He's since been written up here and there called the cellist of Sarajevo, but he has said that he didn't actually want this fame. He wasn't doing this to make a big story or to sell books or to necessarily even inspire other people. But when I thought about him sitting in the middle of Sarajevo and around him as the cello music filled the square, people were running for cover. And there were artillery shells going off in the distance, all around him as he played his cello. And he didn't just do this one day, but he came back for 22 consecutive days to play a piece of music in Sarajevo for those in the city. And he wanted to commemorate the 22 men, women, and children that were killed in a breadline at the start of the war. Now, this story has made me ask myself many times, what would it take to be so undisturbed about what I see going on around me that I can maintain a sense of peace and stillness to be able to bring that to others around me or my community? Now, that sometimes can feel like a tough question in the midst of personal challenges or individual challenges. And while many of us listening tonight will not be in the situation that this man was, surrounded by a war zone, it makes us ask the question, or it sort of invites us, I guess, to ask the question this evening, that whatever might be bombarding our thinking, mentally bombarding us, surrounding us, can we maintain that sense of spiritual equilibrium that allows us to find stillness even in the midst of the toughest situations? Now, sometimes I think we're tempted to think that finding stillness is about going to a beautiful place like the mountains, maybe a lake, maybe you have a special place on your property or somewhere nearby in your city that you think of as a place of stillness. And those places are wonderful, and it's really renewing sometimes to retreat to them and to come back then to our daily lives. But the question is how we can maintain that peace and quiet that we find in the mountains or in a beautiful countryside, how we can maintain that when we are back in the busy schedule and the regular pace of modern life today, which is usually and often a very fast pace with more things on our to-do list than time in the day, it seems. How can we address those things that are on our to-do list on a daily basis from a place of stillness, from a place of deep, settled calm and equilibrium? Well, again, that's our central question for our talk today. Now, there's an image that you are hopefully seeing on your screen now. And again, as you heard, I'll be toggling back and forth now and then from slides to discussion. And you can control that also on your screen as you're watching. But you should be seeing at the moment a picture on your screen of a cello. And this is an analogy that has helped me to think about the spiritual basis for this concept of stillness. And it really comes from understanding the concept of God. And when I talk about God in Christian Science, we don't think of God as a sort of personified image, kind of distant from us, far away, that maybe steps in and intervenes in our lives once in a while when we're really at our wits' end, but ultimately is kind of just a nice presence that really we maybe feel mostly at church or other times. God in Christian Science is an ever-present, always available sense of spiritual love. And even in the darkest day, that God is the light that gives a little glimmer here and there to show us the spiritual good that's available every moment of the day for us. And sometimes as we're rushing around, it can be tempting to miss it. But the presence of divinity, of divine love, helps us to see and to not miss those moments of spiritual good in our day. Now, I find for myself that the practice of being still is what helps me to not miss those little moments of spiritual good and to value them and to see that those are really at the heart of our day. And this image here of the cello helps remind me of it. I have two children who play instruments and have spent hours and hours in violin and cello lessons with my children. And one of the first things that happens when you go into a lesson, a cello lesson, is that you start to tune your instrument. And the teacher will turn on a tone on a tuner. And this tone is pure and perfect. And then you start to play the instrument, and inevitably it's often out of tune. And you can hear the vibrations that show that it's really out of sync with that perfect tone. And then if you look at your image on the screen, you can see at the bottom there's these little black knobs on the cello. And as those are the fine tuner knobs. And as those knobs are fine tuned, it little by little, incrementally tunes the cello to be in line with that perfect tone. And when I have sat in cello lessons with my kids, if I close my eyes once the instrument is tuned, it sounds like there's only one note, one sound being played. You can hear the perfect unity of the perfect tone and the tuned instrument. And to me, that's what stillness is like. That as we align ourselves with God's love, with the identity of this God that is love that fills all space around us, that's as close to us as our thoughts, that it tunes our lives into that conversation, that divine conversation of goodness. And stillness is like those fine tuners that helps us to be still, to quiet the noise, and to hear that other conversation that's going on. Now, you may be saying, well, how do you do that? Well, we're going to get to that a little bit today. And again, there's a question and answer box. So if we're not quite covering it, you can chat in whatever question you would like to answer to be more specific. As we get started here with this topic, though, I want to just share an idea someone shared with me a couple of years ago about this topic. It was written by a woman named Pam Brown, and she says this: at the center of the most turbulent heart, there is a place of peace, a place beyond time that cannot be touched by change or loss. No tumult can disturb the quietness. No shadow can dim the light. Here in this stillness is rest and healing. Nothing we suffer, nothing that we fear can damage its perfection. That is a stillness that's rooted in a divine origin, a divine source, a stillness that comes directly from this concept of God's power, of divine power. It's not even dependent on our own ability to quiet our lives, but simply on our ability to turn mentally and put aside all of the burdens and concerns and worries we're holding on to just turn ourselves to that light, to that deep, settled calm and stillness that's always present, always there. Now, we have 3 parts today to our discussion about how to do this, how to practice this. And we're going to talk first about some ideas about practicing it for ourselves. And then we'll look at how we practice finding stillness in relationship to others. And then finally, we'll cover what it looks like to think about this in terms of world events. And we have a couple of keynote ideas for our talk. The first one comes from the Bible, and it comes from Psalms 46. Be still and know that I am God. And an idea that really corresponds to this from the textbook of Christian Science is spirit, or God, is heard when the senses are silent. Now, spirit is a term we use for God that really embodies and encompasses that sense that spirit is, that God is everywhere, that God is a spirit, not an image or a personified idea, but really that sense of there being an all-inclusive spirit. And that even though we use the term God today, and that's the idea that we'll be talking about, but that it's really a universal concept. It's really universal love is what we mean by God. It transcends religion, it transcends race and culture and economic status. And that this voice of this divine presence is heard when we quiet our senses, when we're not talking or doing or running around, but we're taking that moment to just close off the things outside of us and tune in to what's going on within. Now, these ideas are coming from these 2 books. As I mentioned, everything from Christian Science is rooted in the Bible. The founder of Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, got all of her inspiration and her ideas from her deep study over many years of the Bible. And her seminal work, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, was written after she had a discovery in 1866 that you'll hear a little more about later, but this discovery helped her to understand more about the healing ideas that come from the Bible and how they can be put into practice in individual lives. So let's get started here with our first part about looking at how we practice stillness for ourselves. And as we think about this, whether we're talking about relationships or the world later, that it all really starts with finding peace with ourselves first. I remember when I was working in human rights work after college, my first job out of college, and I was so excited to save the world. That was my goal. And I found this wonderful job working for a very active and prominent human rights organization. And I would sit in my office and listen to the people around me, and they would tell these incredible stories of the work and the campaigns they were doing around the world to promote individual and human rights for all sorts of different campaigns. But at one point, as I was there a little longer, I started to notice that there were these factions within the office. And actually, there was a situation in one particular part of the office where two of the members of the organization were so angry with each other that they decided they could no longer sit together, and they rearranged the office so they would not have to look at each other as much as possible in the office. And then it started to come out that the two co-founders of the organization were so at odds with each other that they closed their door and had screaming matches regularly. Shortly after I left, it turns out that the two founders actually split off and made two different organizations. And they're still doing effective things today. But what that taught me when I was there was that we can look for peace in the world as much as we would like, but it always starts with peace with ourselves. Now, this might be a lifelong pursuit to find this individual peace, but this idea that we just talked about from the Bible of be still and knowing God is a good starting place. So how do we do that? How do we know God? Well, this is now a little bit of an interactive piece for you all. So I'm going to open up a chat box. And if you look on your screen, if you're in front of your computer, you should see that there is a chat option open. And so I'm going to ask you to open up that chat box right now and just think for a moment about what it looks like for you when you have felt the most at peace with yourself. What does that look like? And how has it been characterized? So what we're going to do is just make a list in the chat box for a moment of the qualities that being at peace reflects. So what characterizes being at peace with yourself? So go ahead and take a moment to go ahead and chat in those ideas and those answers. And I'll just share them with everyone. So one person wrote, there's no mind chatter. Oh, that's an interesting thought from Candy. So no mind chatter. So this sense that we're not listening to all the chatter going on in our heads, but that it's all quiet, that we sort of go into a quiet closet or sanctuary and can really quiet down all the noise outside of us. Somebody else mentioned satisfaction characterizes what it means to really be at peace with yourself. Another person said, knowing love is embracing me and all. Oh, that's excellent, Sandra. And we're going to talk about a story a little bit later where that had direct consequences for an individual. Someone else said, nothing to worry about. Completeness. Listening to God. Oh, this one is great, Margaret. Thank you for saying, trusting how the day unfolds. That's been so key for me, that sense of trust as opposed to the sense of control, of controlling every aspect of the day. Someone else mentioned able to relax and focus, that when we're truly at peace, we are relaxed and focused naturally. Excellent. A few more here, that there's no mental tension, that we're quietly listening for pure good thoughts from God. And that we know we're at peace when we're hearing others and God's ideas. And I would say it's actually when we're hearing God's ideas sort of louder than maybe we're hearing other people. Someone else mentioned that it feels like being safe. Yeah, that being at peace feels very safe. And that there's no outside voices, that there's an inner smile. Oh, these are great. You guys are doing a wonderful job at interacting. That someone else said letting go. And I think, again, Charlene, that letting go is so important because it says that it's, again, the willingness to let things unfold as opposed to having to control and be in charge of them all the time. And then there's just a couple more, not stressed or not worried about tomorrow. Excellent. And it's time to pray and to feel loved. Well, you're welcome to keep chatting in your ideas. I'll leave it open for a minute, but I'm just going to click on this list I have here, which is not nearly as comprehensive as what you just came up with, but just a couple of things that I think have been key for me in knowing what it looks like to really be at peace. that when we feel at peace, we're experiencing harmony and oneness. We are loving rather than judging ourselves or others. We trust and we're willing to let things happen rather than controlling them to happen. There's a sense of joy that isn't tethered to or dependent upon external outside circumstances. That it's a joy that comes from a divine source based in God rather than based in things or people or circumstance. There's a deep sense of calm, and we lose interest in conflict. When we're truly at peace, we're not interested in going over and over the mistakes that so-and-so made at work, or the mistakes that we may have made in our past, or the mistakes that we heard about on the news from a particular individual in politics or in the world, or anyone who might, in other parts of the world and so forth. That we're not interested in rehearsing all of that over and over. That we lose interest in that and we feel a sense of calm that all is well. And then satisfaction, which was already mentioned, but satisfaction roots us in the present moment. That rather than worrying about the past or ruminating about something that happened or being concerned about the future and wondering what's going to happen, that we are truly grounded in the joy of the moment. I remember a friend telling me once when she moved to the center of a large city from a more country-like setting where she had lived for many years. And she said for a few weeks, she just felt so out of her element, like she could not find peace and she was really not settled about where she had moved. And then one day, as she was walking to work, she heard birds singing in the middle of the city. And she said that was a sign from God that she could be satisfied where she was, that nature wasn't gone or elsewhere, but that the goodness was right there. And it completely shifted her thoughts about herself. I think when we're at peace and we're practicing stillness, we notice the little birds that sing in the city, or maybe some other little sign that you find during your day. But we don't miss those little things that God is giving us to show us that satisfaction that is divinely ours. I don't think that means settling for things the way they are or never working to change something for the better. But it means that we're satisfied in knowing God first, in knowing divine goodness and divine love, and that that's enough. All right, so on the right-hand side of our screen now, we're just going to look to see where we are often applying these things. Now, if you think about issues in the world or in your community that you're concerned about or that others might be concerned about, places where people are often looking to find peace, things they're looking to find peace about, what would those things be? So go ahead again, and I'll leave the chat box is still open, so just chat in a few comments about where people are often looking for in your communities a sense of peace, things they would like to find peace about. So someone texted in politics. Yep, that's a good one to start off with. Just there can be such a sense of divisiveness in politics, especially here in America right now. And those of you from other countries that might be joining us, perhaps you're dealing with the same thing, or you've certainly maybe heard the news about some of the divisiveness going on, but that sense of politics and really finding peace about it. Someone else mentioned careers. Yep, careers, work, a sense of job security, maybe a sense of purpose in career, of feeling the meaning behind what we're doing for our work. Excellent. The environment. Yep, that's an excellent one. There can be a sense of instability that tries to grab our attention often. And so how do we find that calm equilibrium in the environment? Entertainment or distractions. Thank you, Candy. Yeah, that, sometimes we need to find peace about all the entertainment that's out there and figure out how do we sift through everything that seems to be clamoring for our attention over and over and over. That there can be so many distractions. So how do we find a peace about that? Someone else mentioned safety in schools. Real big issue right now. drug problems, of overprescriptions, health. Thank you for mentioning health. Yep. A sense of ourselves, our own sense of ourselves, that we want peace about our concept of who we are. Excellent. Really good thought. Decision making, family, home, finding freedom from illness. All right, excellent. Thank you for all those things, everyone. That's really an excellent contribution. All right, I'm just going to turn off the chat box now. And again, if you have other questions that you'd like to pose, the Q&A box is still open for you. And I'm just going to, I think we might have covered all of these that you see on your screen now: relationships, finances, politics, career, family, parenting, world events, busy schedules, and health. I loved the decision making that you mentioned, and also that sense of peace with ourselves and our concept of ourselves. Those are great ones to add to our list today. But I just want to take a brief moment to look at these two lists and to just talk about the differences between them, that often, or sometimes, when we start to pray and find stillness, we realize that we're looking for it about one of the things on the right-hand side. We identify a problem in our relationships or our family or the world, and we decide we're going to sit down and start to pray or think about that or try to process what's going on with it. And ultimately, we're really trying to get to one of the things on the left of the many qualities that you all mentioned: harmony and peace and love and satisfaction. And what I have found is that sometimes we start to think that prayer is about problem solving with a problem at the top and reasoning through that to get to the harmony. But in Christian Science, it's really flipped upside down. It's not a problem-solving model for prayer. What it really is that we start with the idea on the left-hand side, that whatever it is, and you can pick any one of those things that was mentioned today or something you might be thinking about tonight, but as you start, instead with that, not with the problem itself, but going over and picking a quality of being at peace, a quality essentially of God. And we start with those qualities of God and affirm their presence and sort of spend some time kind of chewing on that idea, or sort of deeply focusing on the idea of harmony or love or whatever it is that might come to thought as we start to pray. What happens to me sometimes is that as I get more deeply into those thoughts about the qualities, I'm less focused on whatever the problem was that I started to pray about. And sometimes they even resolve themselves, the challenges. Now we're going to come back to this idea in a minute, but I'm just going to tell you a brief story. And it's a healing experience that I had a few years ago. And it was around the holidays, and I was expecting family to come into town and had friends over. And I was cooking a big meal and preparing all of the holiday festivities and so forth and getting the house ready. And in the process, my children had numerous activities. And so my plate was extremely full. And one particular day I woke up and had not slept very well and had a crick in my neck and was quite stiff in my shoulders and felt rather uncomfortable. And as I do each day, I start off with the Bible and the science and health book that you saw, and I study and read them and really focus on some ideas from them that I want to take throughout my day. But this particular day, and this is a slight exaggeration, but just to illustrate the point, my prayer started off a little bit like, "Dear God, I have a lot to do today. So I really hope that I can find freedom from all this pain so that I can get on with all the things I have to do." It was almost as if I was thinking of God as like this divine assistant for me and all the things that I had going on. That if I just prayed to God or kind of asked in the right way or thought the right thing or found the right idea in the Bible, that maybe I would be free from the pain and I would be able to go about and finish everything else that I needed to do. Well, that particular strategy didn't work. And the next day I woke up and hadn't slept very well from the discomfort, and it was a little bit more painful, and I was even more stiff in my shoulders and neck. And I attempted to pray and focus again, but I was really having a hard time getting to that stillness. I was really focused on the busyness and the pressure and the stress that was surrounding me at this time. So by the third day, when I woke up after having not slept well again, it was so excruciatingly painful that I was really immobile. Even taking one step would send shooting pains up the back of my head and neck, and I couldn't turn my neck from side to side. So I was really forced to be in bed for the day. Now, as I was resting and studying and wanting to really practice some of the ideas we were just talking about, I realized what I had been doing was starting over on that right-hand side, essentially. I had been identifying a problem, sort of talking with God about it, trying hard to listen, but talking a lot with God about it, and then really not finding any kind of result. So as I started to really close off all those racing thoughts and to put aside the challenge, and believe me, I really wanted that relief from the pain, but I could see that I needed to set that aside for a moment and start to understand more about God at the center of my thoughts, rather than keeping me and my challenges at the center of my thinking. And as I did that, what I heard so clearly was this idea that said, I am the shepherd. Now, I hadn't been thinking of shepherds or sheep, but I started to do some exploration in the Psalms and kind of looking around for these ideas of shepherd and sheep. And of course, the 23rd Psalm has a beautiful sense of the sheep resting by still waters, by following the shepherd. And as I did that, I realized I needed to understand what it meant to be a sheep. I had been feeling like the shepherd. I had been feeling in charge, and I'd been feeling all the responsibility. And that little thought about there being one shepherd just arrested my thinking and got me going off in a new direction of thought. Now, how does this happen exactly? Well, in my case, I was forced to stop what I was doing. There was so much pain, and I was immobile. I couldn't physically do what I needed to do. But we don't have to get to that point of being forced to have to stop. What I have found since this time is that by pausing at intervals throughout my day to fully and completely acknowledge God's presence in little ways, just remembering to do it is often enough. And sometimes that's the hardest step, is just remembering to make that a priority. Well, what happened for me at this particular time at Christmas a couple of years ago is that as I spent a few hours just cherishing the concept of being a sheep and putting everything into God's hands, I could see that I needed to stop thinking of myself at the center of my life, to stop thinking of everything revolving around me and how well I did it, and being dependent on my own ability to keep all the balls in the air. That my one job was to turn more readily and more regularly to the shepherd and to be a good follower. Now, I did not grow up with respecting the idea of being a follower. I grew up with the idea of respecting leadership and so forth. But what I realized is that being a good follower of God is what enables us to shepherd others, to provide, to welcome them into our home, to be a good manager or a good director or a good teacher or a good parent. Because we know we are parented by God, we're able to parent our kids. Because we know how God manages us, we can rightly manage others and our lives. Now, we'll just go back for a minute to our slides here as we think about that experience, and I'll just share with you an idea that came from Mary Baker Eddy's writings that seemed to be very appropriate at the time for what I was learning. The scientific unity which exists between God and man, which means all men and women, all of humanity, must be wrought out in life practice. Now, this says to me two things. Number one, there is a scientific unity based on a divine principle which connects us to God and which we experience in practice. Now, this concept of having healing experiences is one that is not necessarily unique to me, but it is something that anyone can understand and put it into practice. And on your screen, you see an article that came from the Washington Post, and it was about a year ago that this was published. And what I was struck by when I read it was this concept. There's a doctor writing about it, and he also has a degree in theology from Princeton. And he's talking about over 100 cases of individuals in his medical practice who were diagnosed with incurable illnesses and who recovered without any medical intervention. So, just to follow up on my story, what happened for me after I had that revelation in my thought about that one shepherd was that all of the tension, all of the pain, and the really excruciating shooting pains and the immobility of my neck freed up. And I was able to go downstairs and join my family on Christmas. So in that one day that I was in bed, pondering those ideas and having my consciousness really transition from sort of a me-centered experience to really focusing on something higher, divine and spiritual, that I had a change in what was going on for me physically. Now, this particular article didn't go into the details, but this doctor is talking about there being over 100 cases where he sees similarities of mental and spiritual principles that were associated with their recoveries. Now, the reason that I find this really useful is because Mary Baker Eddy, over 100 years ago, back in 1866, so a long time ago, she had one of those experiences where she was diagnosed with something incurable, and she had a full, complete transition out of that sense of immobility and incurability. Now, she went on to ask that question, was this unique to me, or is this something that anyone can practice? And as she started to put into practice the ideas she was learning from the Bible into her thoughts about others, she saw that other people were having healing experiences as well. She understood God as this impartial, universal sense of love, and that there was a unity with divine presence that all of us can seek out and find in our experience as we practice that sense of being still and quieting all the external thoughts around us. Now, she went on to write her book and to share that book with the world so that individuals, regardless of religion, regardless of background or economic status or wherever someone might be in their understanding, that any person could take those ideas and put them into practice in their lives and experience healing. So as we think about peace with ourselves, whether it's with health challenges or our concept of ourselves that someone mentioned, or decision making that we are grappling with, we find that we are designed by God to respond to God's shepherding, not to react to our environment. That each one of us exists as the glory of God expressed, that we're the outcome of what God is doing. And this keeps us from feeling squeezed and pressured and stressed into running ourselves ragged all the time. And that this unity of God and each one of us governs all action, all emotion, all thought. Now, as we take this into our sense of relationships with others, we're going to look at something that Paul wrote to the Philippians. And he wrote this numerous times in his letters as he was traveling and writing to people about Christ Jesus. And he said, "You have the mind of Christ." Or, "Let that same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus." Now, what does this mean to have the mind of Christ? What does that mean to you, to have the mind of Christ? I'm actually going to open up the chat box here because I would love for you all to feel like as you're reflecting on this that you're welcome to just chat into the chat box again. If you have any thoughts about what that looks like for you, the mind of Christ, everyone will be able to see them. I may not get to all of them, but please feel free to add your ideas into the conversation. I think for me, there's a few things that the mind of Christ sort of embodies. That the first one is that we've talked a little bit about how we can let go of feeling like we're in charge all the time. That it helps us to think beyond ourselves, to think more broadly. It keeps us from feeling superior to anyone else. It sees an equality of all of the ideas created by God, as all of us are the children of God. Someone mentioned in the chat that we see others as perfect. We see their true character and nature as the glory of God expressed. And that is the beauty that connects each one of us. It's a selfless quality, thank you. And it sees each of us in God's image, in God's likeness, as it says in the chapter of Genesis in the Bible, Genesis 1, the first chapter. Now, another key for me of the mind of Christ is that it means we don't have to humanly analyze every little detail about our problems to find a solution. That the mind of Christ can be like that thought that came and arrested me in my thinking and turned me in a new direction. And that all relationships with others connect through knowing God first. So the mind of Christ says that we are closer to God than to any other person. And as we listen to that oneness with God, it gives us our thoughts about other people. And that is a great relief to me. So I'm just going to share another story with you now of a friend of mine from many years ago now. Oh, and I'll just add one more thing from the chat that someone said that we refuse to be fooled by an outside picture. Yeah, that's great. That rather than looking at the external picture, we see through it and beyond it into the deeper image underneath. Great. And I'll just leave this chat open over here in case you want to add anything else. But I'll just share a brief story with you about a friend of mine from many years ago now. And she was working in her home and she was cleaning up and she had a glass fall off and it shattered into a million tiny little pieces. And one of them got embedded in her eye. And her husband was very nervous, so he rushed her off to the emergency room. And when she got there, the doctors examined her and they could see that she had this piece of glass embedded in her eye. And they said they just needed to do a small procedure to get the glass out. Well, my friend was feeling nervous and worried and fearful and concerned. And she just could not find that stillness. She was trying hard to, right there in the hospital, quiet all the thinking, the fears, the worries, the perspectives of the doctors, the concerns of her husband. She was trying to shut all of that out, but it felt like it just kept creeping in. So one thing that she did is she called for help. And she called me as a Christian Science practitioner of healing and asked if I would pray for her in that moment. Now, we just had a brief moment on the phone, but the idea that came from that mind of Christ was for her to go back into the hospital and just love everyone that she saw. Well, she thought she could do that. So she hung up the phone and she walked back into the hospital. And as she did, she instantly felt this wave of love just wash over her. She said it was like this real feeling where everything else fell away. All the fear, all the worry, all the concern. Rather than feeling like she had to analyze every little thought, they just fell away. And she fell in love with everyone there. She loved the nurses and the patients and the doctors and her husband. And she just could feel this overwhelming sense of love for everything around her. And she said at that moment, as she walked back in, the piece of glass fell out of her eye. The doctors examined her and they said they couldn't see anything wrong, that the piece of glass that was there was suddenly no longer there and she could go home. They didn't need to do anything for her. Her husband was pretty much in tears on the way home, tears of gratitude. But it was the effect of that sense of love that she was feeling. The effects of that overwhelming sense of being embraced and encompassed in love that was most important to her. She was grateful that the glass was removed, but more importantly, she hadn't felt that sense of love like that in such a long time, that she felt so grateful to be able to know that kind of love. Now, Mary Baker Eddy talks about an idea of this kind of experience, and she says this: there is a rest in Christ, a peace in love. The thought of it stills complaint. The heaving surf of life's troubled sea foams itself away, and underneath is a deep settled calm. The thought of love, of the peace of love, stills complaint, brings stillness to those things of which we complain. It exchanges our thoughts of complaint for thoughts of love for others. So in conclusion about relationships, and again, we're just scratching the surface, just little sparks of thoughts in this brief talk today, but as we are still and we seek God, it says that to know God is to know others. That the more we know and express that love of God, the closer we become to others. And that sometimes all of our attempts to get to know another person, to try to repair a relationship, to try to fix a problem, sometimes those go unheeded. Sometimes they don't repair what we're hoping they would repair. But when we sort of turn aside to get to know God better, that there's this natural transition, this natural shift in the relationship that we're not orchestrating, but that as we yield to that unity with God, we feel that presence with the other person. And that the mind of Christ says that we can get our thoughts about others from what God knows about them, rather than from their behavior or from what they say. Someone mentioned in the chat that it was seeing perfection in others. To me, that's what this means, that we get our ideas about others from what God tells us about them. Now, I don't want to neglect our last part here today, which is about applying this to the world and to how we can think about world events. And you may have noticed there's a few quotes down here on the screen, and this one is from Psalms, and for this section, and it just talks about be still and commune with your own heart. And we'll talk a little more about that in a while, but I think that has a lot to do with how we approach world events. And I'm just going to share a little story that kind of can get us started in thinking about some of these global events. We mentioned the environment, we mentioned school safety, gun violence, for example. There's lots of things in the news about Syria today, and whatever it is, though, that might be overwhelming your thoughts about the world. This story has helped me often in thinking about it, and it was from a contest that was held many years ago for children. The contest asked children to draw their image of what peace looked like, and the winning picture was a huge, roaring, rushing waterfall with lots of turbulence down at the bottom where it's all stirred up. And the child had drawn this waterfall. And if you've ever been there, you know that waterfalls are not necessarily a calm, kind of quiet place, that often a waterfall can be very loud, and you can actually be having to shout to the person next to you if you're standing down where the water is all churned up. But on the ledge right behind the waterfall, the child had drawn a little yellow canary, and they drew the canary as singing. And that was the picture that they chose to represent peace. Now, this brings us back a little bit to that opening story of the cellist. That peace is not about escape. It's not a void. Peace isn't about never having bad things happen. It's not about being completely free of challenges. That peace is about being able to be like that canary and sing in the midst of the turbulence, in the midst of whatever's being stirred up. That even though it's not easy, that right where we are in the middle of a crowded street or the busiest traffic or whatever might be pulling on our sense of equilibrium, that right there we can pause and find that unity with God that allows us to feel as free as that canary. Now, one of the things, and I'm just going to turn off the chat box now because we're getting near the end, but thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts today. I'll just, one of the last things that was said in the chat is how God does all of this through Christ. And isn't that a great idea, a great concept, that God works through us by giving us that mind of Christ. Now, Mary Baker Eddy, as she was being receptive to that mind of Christ and how God was working through her, she saw a need in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the turn of the last century. She saw a need for there to be a source for news whose intention was honest and trustworthy and that blessed humanity. Now, that news source has continued to this day. It's called the Christian Science Monitor, and it monitors the good in the world. Now, this doesn't mean it has a Pollyanna approach to only seeing the sunny side of things and kind of ignoring the news that's negative. But what it does is it serves as a way to help locate and identify some of the stories of light in what may seem to be a really dark place. Now, one of those for me has been the story of Syria, which I've been following closely for a couple of years. And a friend recently sent me an article that I was reading today about Syria. And it was, again, a pretty dire news story from the violence over the past weekend. And then after I read it, I turned to the recent news update from the Christian Science Monitor, and the editorial today said this: peace in Syria, when it comes, will be defined as much by shared values as by the peculiar interests of each nation. Realpolitik must yield to real principles. The article talked about how Russia's agreement to a humanitarian pause to let civilians escape the fighting, that this reflected a respect for the sovereignty of innocent individual lives over the sovereignty of Russia's ally, the Assad regime. This honors the United Nations call from 2005 of a responsibility to protect civilians and innocent ones. As I was thinking about this tonight and thinking about how we can find a way to maintain a sense of hope, a sense of calm, and not be disturbed by all the buffetings and the push and pull and the bombardment of the news stories. That the monitor is a tool for that. And that ultimately it's as we defend that ability in our own thought to turn ourselves away from the rushing turbulence that might be so loud and clamoring for our attention, that we just see a little glimmer of what God is doing. That there's that we take a stand for the pause in the noise. I know, for example, that if I can't pause the noise in my own thoughts, about a particular world issue like Syria, then I don't have much hope that the Assad regime can do it either. But as I find in my own consciousness an ability to hold to one idea, one element of goodness, that element of goodness can multiply. And again, I don't think it's looking on the bright side in light of a huge mountain of impossibility and challenge. But whenever God feels small and the world's problems feel really big, I find that rather than continuing to focus on the world's problems, it's a call for me to really focus more on my concept of God and that concept of the Christ and that ability of the Christ to speak to individual thought and arrest it with a new idea that can challenge and transform and bring healing and resolution of conflict. So in closing tonight, as we think about the world and trying to find a sense of peace about world events, this idea from Psalms that we search our hearts and be silent is a call that keeps us from getting pulled down the current of thought too quickly. A few years ago, I was whitewater rafting out in Colorado with a friend who was guiding the boat. It was my first time ever whitewater rafting. And she was teaching me how to read the river. And she said to look for the eddies in the river because those are the still places. And after you finish a particularly difficult rapid and navigating it as you paddle, that if you see an eddy in the river, which is, again, a kind of a still sort of swirling place behind a rock that's rooted in the bedrock of the river, if you steer your boat in there, you won't get pulled down with the current of the river. Your boat will stay still and you won't get pulled down the current. And to me, that's what the Christian Science Monitor does and what Stillness allows us to do about world thought. That we don't want to get carried so far down the river of thought that we come to the conclusion that everything is hopeless, that something horrid is about to happen, that the whole world is falling apart. That if we remain in that kind of spiritual eddy, we can look for the glimmer that helps us to remain focused on defending the good that exists in the world. That this conviction of peace breaks through the kind of mental mesmerism that would try to say that there's nothing to be redeeming about the situation. Now, there isn't often anything to be redeemed in a sense of genocide or bloodshed or killing of innocent people. But as we defend the right for those perpetrating violence to be woken up, to be alert to the needs of innocence, we are participating in the breaking through of that conflict. That it starts with a mental shift towards humanity and towards goodness. And the peace of stillness gives us this confidence and this hope. Now, I didn't leave a lot of time tonight, unfortunately, for questions, but if you do have any, you're welcome to chat them in. There was one actually that got sent, and I'll just share this one question. And if you have anything else burning, we'll just take a couple of minutes here to answer any questions that you'd like to post in the question and answer box. But one question that was sent in tonight was, and I'll just read it here. Can you share a good way to close out the unwanted noise, the worries, the problems, the train of endless mortal thoughts, etc., when you're seeking that desired stillness? I find the big problem is when I go into my closet that Jesus spoke of in the Sermon on the Mount, there is a foot in the way, preventing the door from closing and letting in all those worries and problems. Sometimes it's possible to close that door, but I'd like to know how to do it more consistently. Well, that's a wonderful question. Thank you for sending it in. And the idea that has helped me often is first of all to just, when I'm going into that mental closet and shutting the door, which is really key, if it feels like a foot is stuck in the door and it's just not shutting, for me, that's a sign that not to give up or say, well, I guess this isn't going to work, or, oh, I'm doing it again. I'm just not able to shut out all these things. And what's wrong with me? But an opportunity to just notice what's happening, to notice that it feels difficult to shut the door, and to kind of face that foot, that sort of metaphorical foot that's trying to keep it from shutting. And that the way that works for me is by understanding that we are each designed to know thoughts from God more than we know thoughts from any other place. That God's thoughts feel like our friends. And all of the other thoughts that don't feel like our friends, we can just let fall away and let go of. And rather than feeling like we have to understand where they come from or why they're there, or why a particular thought keeps persisting and trying to bother us. Another sure sign for me is that repetition of a thought is a key idea that it's not from the source being in God. That God doesn't repeat things over and over until we get them, but that sort of drone of repetition is a sign that we can let those thoughts go, that they're not from a divine source. And that if we're meant to hear a thought from God, from Spirit, that it will be so irresistible that we can't possibly even get in the way of it. Now, sometimes my prayer just sounds a little bit like, Father, Mother, God, please let me not get in the way of what you are speaking. And the humility that allows us to put aside our own concerns and worries, sometimes I think helps that door shut fully. Helps us to quiet the clamorings of what we want or what we feel like is unsolved, and to be satisfied with something little. And that builds the satisfaction in our lives. Well, thank you all so much for participating today in this talk. I'll just close with a couple of ideas in summary. That being still is what tunes us into our oneness with God. That as we close the door on the senses, we hear that voice of Spirit speaking about our oneness. And whatever technique works for you, whether it's deeply studying the Bible or another, in science and health book, or reading the Christian Science periodicals or spiritual ideas of some sort, or whether it's just writing all the thoughts down and crumpling them up and throwing them out the door so that they can stop trying to sort of cycle in our heads. But whatever helps us to find those moments of quiet. For me, it's just, again, remembering throughout the day to make that a priority. And that helps to tune into that stillness that's right present in the middle of whatever we might be doing, however busy our day might be. That when we're looking for resolution in relationships, that we can look beyond the behavior to see that others are the evidence of God expressed. And then that as we look to our own hearts for our unity with God, it helps us to be effective contributors to spreading the ideas of peace around the world. So we'll close with an idea from Mary Baker Eddy. She says that mind revolves on a spiritual axis, and its power is displayed and its presence felt in eternal stillness and immovable love. Thank you all so much for joining our talk tonight. If you have any other questions that you didn't chat in, or any comments you'd like to make, you may put them in the question and answer box, and I'll leave it open for about another 5 minutes to answer any questions that you may have following the talk. Thank you so much again for joining us.